So I've got a tool here to do this, which somebody kindly made for me many years ago. I made one myself too, but it wasn't as pretty as that, and it's somewhat worn out as a result. I think making it out of rubbish steel was also my downfall. So the shutter assembly here, I'll put that to one side. I'll deal with that separately. That's a little, oh, it was sand down here. I have to wipe all this off. Very gritty. Okay, at the top here, this is the screw that couples to our rangefinder. You can probably see it swings backwards and forwards as I move the focus scale. The focus scale on this camera, I was told that somebody had scratched numbers in there to correct for the focusing misalignment, but that's not the case. The focus scale here is metric. It's marked in meters. Somebody has scratched numbers in here for feet. So at roughly the 3 metre mark here, it's got 10 scratched in it. At the 10 metre mark there, it's got a 3 scratched in front of the 0 for 30. And so on. When you get down here to the 2 metre mark, it's got a 7 scratched in there for 7 feet. At 1.5 metres there, it's got 4 scratched in it for 4.5. So somebody has made an attempt to change the scale on there to imperial from the manufacturer's scale, which was metric. That scale I'll replace with one that is just metric, because the owner hasn't expressed any difficulty with working with metric. Let's see if we can get this coupling arm out of here. It doesn't really want to come. That's better. Yeah, that's just a bit sticky and gritty. The focus scale. I need to mark the focus scale so that I know the position, the accurate position of the focus scale ring to the outer helical. And then I need to mark the outer helical with the inner helical so that I can tell its correct position too. So first I'll swing that to roughly the infinity position. I'll scrape 2 bright lines across the focus scale ring and the outer helical at the bottom, one at the top. Now I can remove the 4 screws holding the focus scale ring in place. Take those 4 screws away. The grease in the focus helical here is quite sticky. I'll take these 2 screws out here for the shroud over that gear at the front of the shaft. Take that shroud away. Oh. Yeah, it's a bit reluctant to move. There's the gear, and that gear couples from the cocking rack at the back of the camera through to the shutter at the front. Take those pieces out. Lift off our focus scale ring. And here, normally what I want to do is I want to note the position of the inner and outer helical relative to each other. And normally I do that by turning this till they are dead level. They're flat, level, The front surfaces are nice and level against each other, and that's usually a good spot for me to be. That looks good. And then I'll continue my scratch marks that I'd made on the outer helical across to the inner helical at that point. There are other marks on here that were put there during assembly or during earlier servicing. So I put my own marks there that I can recognise so that I'm fairly clear which marks relate to what. If there are existing marks and you can understand what those marks mean, then by all means use them. Don't bother making any extras. But generally I've found that it's not always clear what those marks were, and as a result that can cause a problem. So I've just taken out the 4 black screws that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. I'm taking out the 4 nickel plated screws, the round headed screws that hold the focus assembly onto the front standard now. I can lift that off. I'll just recover those screws. Now I'm just putting all these components into one container because I'm going to put them in the ultrasonic cleaner. I know where they all go. If you're unfamiliar with it, and you probably are, your best bet is to lay out all the screws along with the component they fixed, so you know what screws went with what, which will be less efficient in terms of cleaning, but it'll be more efficient in terms of being able to get things back together in a working state. Right, so this is very sticky. And this grease is, oh, yeah, very dry. Back to the body. Now I want this front standard and the shroud, bellows shroud off here. So we've got 4 screws hold the shroud into the body. In some cases the screws screw directly into the aluminium shroud. In others they screw into little metal bushes that are pressed into the shroud. None of those screws are enthusiastic about coming loose. I'll put a drop of naphtha on there and I will give it a hurry up. I'll get the fine adjustment tool. Yeah, it doesn't want to stay in that slot. That's it. Putting some torsion on that screwdriver and giving it a couple of taps. Is usually enough to get those screws moving. You don't want to beat hard on there. You do not want to knock the top of the camera or the base of the camera inwards. Because if you do, things don't move smoothly. Right, so the screws are loose. The bellows shroud should come out. Oh, the bellows are stuck to the back of the front standard. And pushing them back in. There's a felt light trap gasket sort of arrangement there. Often it's going to come off in pieces. You can put it back together. That's not the end of the world. Now this is absolutely chocker with sand. You look at the state of this. So this is like a day to the trip to the beach now. This is just bloody awful. So it's no wonder that the camera is a little bit stiff and reluctant to move. and it wouldn't be at all surprise me if that didn't lead to the shutter cocking rack failing when force applied at one end of the chain sufficient to move things at the other end of the chain meant that the weak link in the middle was stressed right out and died. Alright, just pull these bits out and I'll press in those buttons top and bottom. I should be able to slide this back out, and I'm keeping my thumbs over those buttons to catch them so that the springs don't disappear off into the bushes. Now, push it back a bit, you can see the enormity of the problem. What have we got? Yeah, we've got stuff everywhere. Okay. So, a little bit of cleaning is going to have to be done here. I've got to get rid of all of the sticky old grease and filth off those components. Tip the sand pit out of this camera, clean up all these pieces so that they look like clean metal again instead of a piece of sandpaper, and find the pieces for this little light trap and sort of glue everything back in position. Oh, and this piece here too. The shutter release in the camera body couples to this piece, and this piece in turn couples to the shutter to release it. Now, there was some very isolated corrosion with this camera. One of the screws on the film advance lever had rust on it. It was reluctant to come out. There hasn't been an enormous problem with corrosion elsewhere. There's little patches that don't look particularly bright, but there's nothing seriously wrong there that I think will, nothing that I can see that won't clean up okay. Now, it's never going to be a beauty queen, but it should clean up to make a good working camera. And of course, this scale ring here that somebody has handily mutilated, I will put an original metric scale ring back on there, because it's got a metric scale ring at the base for the wide and tele lenses, and everything needs to match one way or the other. Well, I've been busy while you weren't watching, and I have the camera body mostly back together. Of course, needs a rangefinder on the top and the top cover put on, but the camera body is otherwise complete. The focus is now smooth. The focus scale ring here, I've replaced that scale. As I said, someone had neatly scratched in feet numbers there instead of the meters numbers. I've replaced it with a proper metric scale to match the scale on the bottom of the camera. What else? Is anything else of note? Apart from all the filth, apart from all the sand, and a little bit of dried grease, not much, there was very little lubricant in the camera. Cocking rack was ruined, of course. That had already been discovered. There was no surprises there. Nothing else really showed up. There was no obvious fault with the film advance other than the bad cocking rack and all the filth, all the sand and all the rubbish. And with a new cocking rack and everything cleaned up and running smoothly, it swings nicely, everything's moving very smoothly indeed. So I'm expecting it to be an easy ride from here on in. The camera appears to be good. I've got the Leatherettes back on the base, even replaced the missing dot, the patch on the film advance. Had to straighten up the strap lug at this end of the camera that had been thumped in. This mounting lug up here with the top cover fits, that seems to have a bit of a lean outwards onto it, so it suggests that the whole top cover is being pushed this way. I may well have to adjust to the position of those posts at either end to make sure that the top cover is centered correctly. if it's pushed off at one end from drop damage, it can jam. The shutter release button in particular is one of the things that can jam, so it doesn't pop back up correctly. And then you can have problems with the shutter not cocking correctly. So that's a possibility. It's by no means the prettiest camera I've come across, and it's probably got its share of issues. The arms, top and bottom of the door here, I had to take them off and straighten them out, but they did straighten up well, and the door opens and closes nicely. There's no problem there at all. So that's progress so far, but it's an important break in the day. It's 2 minutes to 12 and the worms are biting. I need to be fed. Well, lunchtime has been and gone. I've been working steadily on this camera. The camera body I got complete. It even looks quite tidy. The loss of paint around the edges of the doors and so forth, that's going to be a feature for the rest of its natural life. As will the discoloration of the alloy edges of the body there. That's certainly corrosion's done that. But the camera itself functions well. All I had to replace was the shutter cocking rack. That was absolutely ruined. There was no danger I was going to be able to do anything with that. The rangefinder has been cleaned. No problem struck there. Somebody'd certainly been in and playing with that. I had to do a fair bit of sorting out of adjustments, but now the viewfinder's clean to see through. The rangefinder works correctly, and that's all functioning nicely. The shutter, that was a bit interesting. The shutter was very reluctant to move. It was gummed up. There was a bit of corrosion about the place, just on the outside edge where the curved pusher and the curved rack went. That seemed to be gummed up, and it mostly seemed to be dirt and possibly a little bit of corrosion. It just cleaned away fairly easily, but it was certainly stiffer to cock than it should have been. That would have loaded up the cocking rack, of course. The shutter itself, I did get it to fire once I'd taken all the outside case off the shutter. I was able to cock it, and it did release. It was reluctant to release. It certainly didn't race away into function, but it did work. So basically the shutter had the potential to go, but it needed to be serviced. It certainly appeared to me that somebody had been in there at some stage in the past and serviced the shutter. It was a bit mixed what I found in there. A lot of damaged screw heads, but the diaphragm blades were very clean, absolutely oil free. There's very little cleaning required for those. Shutter blades, a little bit more marked. Certainly they weren't particularly oily. There was nothing particularly sticking them up. So the blades looked quite good. The mechanism plate itself, by comparison, looked quite dirty. And it appeared to me that had never been cleaned. It's like somebody'd sort of done half a CLA on the shutter. It's always hard to understand. Excuse me, it's hard to understand some of the things you find inside cameras, but they've passed through a lot of hands over time, so you know there's various people have had their hands in there, poking and prodding. The main thing is it goes. It appears to go quite well. I think this will be a good user, and that's what it's destined to be. So it didn't look particularly promising to start with, given that the film advance lever wouldn't move at all when I started, but now it's a good one. So thanks for watching. Before I go, this shutter cocking rack. Now we know it was useless. And we know that the teeth were damaged, and in particular, most importantly, that end tooth there is folded right over and prevented it from being able to mesh with the gear on the top of the film advance. And the teeth here are a little bit damaged too. But there's a munch marks all the way along the back here. Someone's done something to that rack, and when I flipped it over, there are more munch marks all the way along it here. Someone has punched that to stretch out the rack, I believe, probably to get better meshing between the rack teeth and the gear teeth. There really wasn't a problem with that with a good rack. And this rack, I fail to see why that would have been necessary. Had someone really just loosen screws, move things across, tighten screws back up. There shouldn't have been a problem requiring that. So that back surface there, of course, is very rough after this has been punched in. Someone just cut into that with the edge of a screwdriver or something. They've used it like a chisel to stretch that metal out, and this back edge as a result is quite rough. It would never have moved smoothly through the camera. The other end of the rack, it's quite worn. Certainly this sort of scuffing mark here, that is quite typical of sand and grit having got in there, and that's just been scuffing, and that would have made the action of the shutter cocking rack, the whole mechanism, quite stiff as well. So there, the shutter cocking rack was the main fault. I have to say that was probably induced. The problems with that rack were probably induced. It was somebody doing the wrong thing to sort out a perceived problem. That rack, there was no danger I was going to be able to sort that out.